Welcome to Impactful. Today we are diving into the future of journalism. Not just what's happening now, but what might happen in the next 5, 10, or even 15 years. We'll explore the report AI in Journalism Futures 2024, a global effort to understand how AI could reshape the way we share and receive information. This conversation is not just about technology, it's about the future of trust, access to information, and the role journalism plays in our society. Today we are joined by David Caswell, someone who has deeply shaped how we think about the future of journalism in the age of AI. David is the founder of StoryFlow and the co-author of AI in Journalism Futures 2024, a report that challenges us to imagine what's coming and to prepare for it with clarity and care. The report AI in Journalism Futures 2024 explores possible long-term impacts of AI in journalism. To start, could you explain what the scenario approach is and how you use it in the project? What method did you follow when creating the publication?
This is the AI in Journalism Futures project, and it's a scenario development project. So there's a technique for trying to understand what the possible scenarios are for uncertain futures. And this is it's a well-established technique. Many large corporations use scenario planning. Many governments use scenario planning. Many militaries use scenario planning. And essentially what it tries to do is to systematically map out the range of plausible scenarios without trying to predict kind of which one is going to develop or what the actual situation is. So it's not a foresight or a kind of a prediction or a future forecasting exercise. It's more about trying to understand kind of what the range of things are. So this was a project that developed. It was funded and originated with the Open Society Foundation, and it was kind of based on this hypothesis, which I think most people are kind of in agreement with, which is that with AI in journalism, the initial work that's going on in newsrooms kind of right across the world, and it is a lot of work that's going on, almost all of that is focused on making very familiar tasks and workflows and products more efficient. So it's focused on kind of the existing understanding of how the business works, how the competitive environment works, how the ecosystem, the information ecosystem as a whole works. And it assumes that all that's going to remain the same, except that this little task here will be more efficient, or we can produce these little products here that we're already familiar with, like summaries or newsletters or whatever. And that period is well underway. Lots of newsrooms are doing that.
What was the main hypothesis behind the whole project?
The functionality from AI is so fundamental to what news does. I mean, it deals with the heart of information, that sooner or later, it's going to add up to something more than just making the existing way we do journalism more efficient. It's going to add up to a whole new, very different kind of information ecosystem. This is somewhat similar to how the introduction of smartphones with beginning with the iPhone in 2007, that fundamentally changed how the information ecosystem worked. Social networks and the use of social networks to distribute news and so on and so on. And even further back, the internet itself, moving from a purely print or a purely kind of physical distribution environment to those early years of blogging and so on. But this fundamental change in the way information was distributed that was caused by the internet itself. And then even further back, the printing press did a similar kind of fundamental change. Well, this hypothesis is that the functionality from AI is going to add up to a fundamental change in the information ecosystem. It might be as small as mobile, it might be as large as the internet or even the printing press, but it's going to be a significant change. So what we're trying to do with this scenario planning process is forget about the efficiency, forget about the sort of the near term making the existing workflows more efficient, and focus on, well, what might this add up to in the long term? And so we went through this in a very, very kind of systematic way.
The project started when you opened a call for people to send in their ideas about the future. You received more than 900 applications. What happened next? What was the following step?
We selected 40 of those that were particularly kind of grounded and well-reasoned and thoughtful and insightful and creative. And then for those 40 people that submitted those, we asked them to develop their scenario a bit more, so that to kind of spend some more time thinking about it and developing it into a small kind of 5-page, 4-page, 5-page description of it. And then we also brought in about 20 other experts in media, some of them some very big names. And then we had this scenario planning workshop in Italy in April 2024. And that was a very formal, structured scenario planning workshop. It wasn't just one of these kind of things where people just sort of like show up and have a chat. It wasn't that at all. It was very formal, very systematic. It built on the preparation that these people had been doing for months before the workshop. So everybody came into the workshop, having been working on their scenario for months, basically. So everybody was very well prepared, and then it was a very structured kind of a 4-part process we went through, guided by a professional facilitator of scenario planning, a person who does a lot of work for governments and large companies. And then that delivered a lot of information. And then in May and June, we kind of boiled that down into this report that describes the scenarios and the process that produced them.
How did you organize all the collected ideas? How did you sort them and put them into groups?
We ended up with 5 core scenarios. There was one that we call machines in the middle, and it's essentially about an environment where large language models and AI is doing the reading, the transcribing, natural language text or speech. It's basically kind of monitoring large chunks of the sources of news, and it's doing that systematically, continually. And so, one way to look at this is it's like you have tens of thousands of journalists that can just read every press release, listen to every speech, whatever they have, read every report. And that's on the news gathering side, but then also on the production of the experience of news. Right now we see things like, summaries and emails produced by AI, but it's obvious that we're going to have a lot more variety and kind of personalized and customized experiences in audio and video and in all kinds of different forms of text in different languages and so on. And so what machines in the middle, what that scenario is about is the combination of both of those. Is it, if you have an AI-enabled newsroom and it's using AI for a bunch of the news gathering and it's using AI for a bunch of the creation of the experience, then that's the machines in the middle scenario.
Could you briefly present the second scenario that came out of this process?
We called this scenario "Power Flows to Those Who Know Your Needs," and so it was a very in some ways kind of small p political view where that the source of that knowledge becomes exceptionally important. And there was two aspects to that. One was as you'd expect would be data about users, but not just data in the way that we have newsroom analytics now, although that is obviously important, but new kinds of data that are possible only with AI. So very much more nuanced, much more granular, much more textured views of audiences and their needs and their behaviors. But you can now assemble that as data because you have machines that can observe and understand that. So the data was one. But then the second one, which I think is probably even more important, is the role of humans, of people who are essentially representatives of their audience. They know their audience very, very deeply, far deeply than any machine is ever going to know the audience. They know their values, they know how they live their lives, they know what they talk about, they know what they laugh at, they know all of this stuff that you really have to be kind of in the audience itself to know. And then they use that knowledge to bring this AI-enabled information orchestra to produce something that is relevant to that audience. And so there's a term that I increasingly use for this. I don't think I use it in the report, but I listening as a service, where the value that kind of journalism delivers is more about the listening and respecting of the audience in a very deep way than it is about kind of just broadcasting.
There was also a scenario more focused on society, about how different groups might use AI for information in very different ways. Could you explain that one?
The name we gave to the scenario was omnipotence for me, noise for you. And that was like represented the in some ways the worst case, but sort of the macro case for this, which is that some people will become, they will develop superpowers because they can use AI to understand the world in far greater, depth and breadth than they ever could in any other way, because they've now got this, this set of tools that enables them to digest. It's like being, the president of the United States and having the whole CIA who's just delivering a little briefing document to you every day. It's that kind of an enhancement of your ability to understand the world using AI. So that's one group. But then you've got this other potential, which is that AI is used in ways that don't enable kind of agency or power in the individual. They're used for things like entertainment or distraction or things that are very, very good, far better than, say TikTok or YouTube are now because of these AI tools, but don't lead anywhere. They don't provide information. They don't kind of provide education or growth or enable agency or power in the individual that's consuming them. They just soak up their time, right? And that was this sort of concern, was that you would have this bifurcated or this kind of two-speed world, where one group of people, become much, much more, superpowered with this, and one with this other group becomes less so. And that you kind of already see that happening with social media and digital media, but the scenario was that this is amplified dramatically by AI.
Then there was a scenario about restrictions, limits on the use of AI. What does that scenario describe?
So there was a lot of discussion about this, and some of that discussion was around regulation and kind of legislation and government-led restrictions. But most of it was not. Most of it was about other kinds of restrictions on AI, particularly choices that audiences may make, or some audiences may make, not to use AI. And so there's actually a lot of evidence for this in the existing ecosystem around like some forms of news avoidance, for example, or even more broadly in kind of an accelerating appreciation for kind of non-digital forms of music and other experiences. This kind of rebellion against this kind of flat digital world, and so that's a very small part of societies now. But news avoidance is actually quite large in terms of its percentage of audiences. And it's quite plausible that you could see, especially if AI is used in kind of very untrustworthy or distracting ways, you could see large populations or large percentages of the audience basically opting out of AI. And there was a series of other kind of non-regulatory constraints as well that we explored. But in that scenario, AI, even though it would be possible for it to operate much more broadly in the information ecosystem, in fact, it actually doesn't happen that way because it's not attractive to audiences for various reasons.
And finally, there was the fifth scenario where AI gains some level of agency and power. What does that mean in practice, and how is that world imagined?
So this was an extreme scenario. Our time horizon for this project was 5 to 15 years, and this would be more in the 15-year kind of range. But that's about is it's not about, AI taking over the world, although, the way people are talking, who knows, right? But it's not about that. It's about a situation where humans, journalists, members of the public, everybody basically hand over willingly more and more control of the information ecosystem to AI. And we keep doing that. So maybe it's easier to do some task in the newsroom, and then it's easier to do some other task. And then, well, we just kind of hook up the news gathering machine to the other machine. And then somebody leaves and some new person comes and they're not really familiar with how all this is working. And slowly over time, we lose the ability to understand how our information ecosystem is working. And then we get to a point where the AI essentially, or this kind of ecosystem of AIs that are managing our information ecosystem, we don't know what they're doing. They have essentially their own agency and their own power and their own sort of controls. And we don't, we can see they're doing stuff and we're consuming it, but we don't know what's going on inside. And there's a big precedence for this, and the precedence is the financial system. The financial system used to be relatively centuries ago, relatively simple, understandable by many people. But there are very, very few people these days who understand, the financial systems at the global flows of capital and so on. And so that trajectory, you could quite easily imagine that trajectory happening with information flows if AI became a major part of it.
When you gathered all these perspectives, which scenarios or moments were the most surprising? Was there anything that really stood out during the project?
Each of those was kind of surprising in its own way, more because it was a way to kind of distill or kind of boil down all of these kind of different ideas and speculations from all of these people down into this sort of core set. There was another set of surprises that came from just kind of observations or insights from the process as a whole that didn't end up as scenarios, but were just sort of like standing back from what was happening and having a look. One that was the most surprising of those for me, and also for Shui Fang, my co-author of the report and the manager for all of this from the OSF. She's the driving force behind it. Her and I at the workshop basically kind of came to this realization that much of the conversation and the developing scenarios were actually not about AI, they were about power, and that power and the transfer of power was this very significant thread in what was going through many people's mind, especially journalists, especially people from an editorial perspective. And we have a little less data on this or sort of observational basis for this, but it seemed that people that were coming at this from the technical side, from the technology end, were more focused on audiences and audience value, more focused on what you might see as a traditional kind of product approach, which is user-centered, design thinking, all that kind of stuff. Whereas on the editorial side, there was an awful lot of focus on power and power transfers. And that shows up in the names of some of our scenarios, power flows to those who know your needs, AI with its own power, and so on. Power seems to be very front of mind in sort of the higher level of the discussion about this.
And finally, what were the reactions from colleagues and the expert community after reading the publication?
One of the interesting reactions is how many people have read it carefully. I'm surprised. That is interesting because it is quite a read, and it is quite a dense read. But a lot of people seem to be reading it carefully, so that's great. I think the big one is that people, which was one of our core objectives for the overall project. People are starting to think about what it all adds up to. So it's not necessarily that they look at the scenarios and say, this is going to happen, I need to plan for this. That's not what we were trying to do, and that's not what is happening. but they're starting to think, well, there's got to be more to this than my strategy of making, my newsletter more efficient or doing my SEO more efficiently. That this has to include, some view of the future. A lot of that at the moment ends up as discussions around our relationships with the model providers. I think that's very appropriate at the moment. I think, sort of understanding how content is valued, how content is how it ends up in these models and in experiences built from these models, and how you get paid for the production of content that's difficult and expensive to produce. So those are big questions that I think will take years to resolve. But I think that's kind of like a reasonable starting point. Another one that I see quite a bit is like senior teams in newsrooms thinking more in terms of creating flexibility to respond to uncertainty. So one of what they're taking from the report is this is an uncertain the coming environment 5-10 years down the road is very uncertain. We don't know how it's going to develop, but it's likely to be significant. Therefore, we can make our organization, our organizational structure, our infrastructure, our CMS, we can make all that stuff more efficient or more flexible now, so that whatever we have to do in the future, we'll have more options to respond to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for watching this episode of Impactful. Don't forget to follow us, and see you next time.